Hello, my name is Eva. To my father, I was a flaw in his perfect legacy, a ghost in the halls of the empire he built. For 10 years, I was the daughter he tried to erase from the family portrait. So at Thanksgiving, with the crystal glasses chiming, he decided to make it official. He stood before us, not as a father, but as an executioner. He wasn't just announcing the sale of our family's legacy. He was announcing my worthlessness to the world and my inheritance. Nothing, not a single cent, not even a splinter from the throne he sat on. He expected me to fade away. He wanted me to become the ghost he always saw me as. What he didn't expect was that this ghost was coming back to own the entire house. Have you ever been told you are not enough by the one person whose approval meant the world to you? Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say, listening in the comments, or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reached. Don't forget to subscribe and join me on this journey, where the unspoken feelings of the past finally find their voice. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. The generic rental sedan crunched up the familiar gravel drive, the sound feeling cheap and out of place in the regal silence of Napa Valley. Around me, the vines stretched in perfect, arrogant rows under the honey gold light of a late autumn afternoon. Valerius Vineyards. It hadn't changed. Still breathtakingly beautiful and coldly remote, just like the man who built it. I'd chosen the anonymous car on purpose. 10 years away had taught me that real power wasn't in what you showed, but in what you could afford to hide. The car came to a stop before the stone facade of the main house, a grand and ancient fortress in a sea of grapes. No one came out to greet me. The silence was the first welcome and the clearest warning. The first person I saw wasn't family. In an old, gnarled block of vines tucked behind the estate, I saw the familiar silhouette of Matteo, our head winemaker, whose calloused hands had touched every vintage Valerius had ever produced in his 40 years of service. His hair was silver now, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. As he gently cupped a cluster of grapes, his expression a mix of affection and concern. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment a rare warmth flickered in his eyes. "Ava," he said, his voice as deep and earthy as the soil beneath our feet. "It's good to see you, Matteo." He didn't ask why I'd returned. He just looked out at the vines, at the twisted ancient trunks clinging to the earth. "This block still remembers you, Eva. It gave us a decent yield this year, but I know if you were here, it could do more." A warmth spread through my chest. A connection. For the first time in a decade, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even for a fleeting second. Hope, that dangerous feeling I'd worked so hard to bury, began to stir. I almost smiled. "Your job is to make wine, Matteo, not poetry." The voice of my father, Arthur Valerius, cut through the air like a shard of ice. He'd appeared without a sound, a phantom in a perfectly tailored suit. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on Matteo. "Don't waste time on sentiment." The warmth vanished. The air grew thick. Arthur had crushed the moment with 2 sentences, diminishing me and my only ally, reasserting that in his world only his will existed. Only then did he turn to me. His blue eyes, the same as mine, held no emotion, just cold appraisal. "Get inside. Your mother is waiting." He swept past me, trailing the scent of expensive cologne and absolute control. Before disappearing through the massive oak doors, he called over his shoulder, his tone casual but laced with threat. Make yourself presentable. We have an important guest tomorrow, someone who will decide the future for all of us. A future that I was clearly being told I was not a part of. The grand salon at Valerius was a perfect stage for wealth and distance. The marble fireplace roared, but the flames seemed to give off no heat. Everything from the ancestral oil paintings to the vast Persian rug projected a cold beauty, something to be admired but never touched. My mother Eleanor sat in a velvet armchair, a glass of Chardonnay in hand. She was as elegant as ever, a beauty carefully preserved by money and silence. Beside her, my sister Eliza was busy with her phone, pouting her lips for the perfect selfie with the fireplace as a backdrop. Ava, darling. My mother said, her voice soft but distant. She pulled me down into the chair opposite her, and for the first time in years, she took my hand. Hers was soft but cold. You're too thin, she said, looking me in the eye with what seemed like genuine concern. Work must be hard in Oregon. I saved the Pinot Noir from your graduation year. We'll open it tonight, shall we? My heart stuttered. A longing for a mother I thought I'd lost surged within me. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she did care. Just as I was about to answer, she leaned in, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Arthur, your father, he's on the verge of a very big deal. So tomorrow, please don't say anything about your modern ideas on winemaking. Just smile and agree. Don't complicate things, will you? Dear. A knife to the heart. The concern wasn't for me. It was for Arthur. It was a warning, a command. She wasn't worried I was thin. She was worried I'd ruin her husband's perfect play. The blow was worse than my father's coldness because it was wrapped in the guise of love. Eliza suddenly broke in, shoving her glowing phone in my face. She's back. Everyone look, my sister Ava is as down to earth as ever, she announced to her invisible audience, turning my return into a piece of social media content. Hashtag family reunion, hashtag vineyard life. I instinctively recoiled from the frame. Eliza pouted. You ruined my angle. I stood up feeling like I was drowning. In this family, I didn't exist as a person. I was a supporting character, either a problem for my father's plans or a prop for my sister's posts. I escaped to the wine cellar, the only place in the house where the silence was peaceful instead of oppressive. The cool air smelled of damp oak, of earth, of time, trapped in priceless bottles. Thousands of them lay sleeping in the dark, liquid archives of the Valerius dynasty. My eyes fell on a neglected corner where a row of oak barrels sat covered in a thin layer of dust. They were empty. The sight was a key unlocking a room in my memory I had tried to seal shut for 10 years. 10 years ago. I was 22, armed with a degree with honors and a heart full of fire. I stood in this very spot in front of my father and Matteo, pitching my passion project. A new experimental Pinot Noir, a rebellion in a bottle. I wanted to use biodynamic farming to honor the rhythms of the land. I wanted to bottle it unfiltered, to let the terroir, the soul of this place, speak for itself, raw and true. My father listened with a faint, unreadable smile. When I finished, my voice trembling with hope, he didn't speak. He picked up a glass of Valerius Reserve, our flagship, and swirled it. Then he spoke, his voice loud enough for every cellar hand to hear. The Valerius taste is about control, perfection, 100-year legacy. This grape juice you want to make. He paused, locking his eyes on mine. It's not wine. It's a childish rebellion. I didn't build this empire on sentimental notions like the soul of the land. He drained his glass and slammed it down on a barrel, the sharp crack echoing through the cellar. When you understand that you can come back and talk to me. The humiliation was a physical fire, scorching me from the inside out. He hadn't just rejected my idea. He'd turned it into a joke, twisted my passion into foolish naivete in front of the very people I respected most. Now, I touched the cold oak of the empty barrel. The shame of that day was still there, a hot ember that had never cooled. I clenched my fists. That was why I left. That was why I created Aura Wines, a name whispered with reverence in Oregon wine circles, a name no one here knew. And that was why I had come back. Julian, heir to the Valerius Empire, was in the library, sipping a wine that I knew cost more than my first 3 months' rent in Portland. He had our mother's blonde hair and our father's smug smile, a perfect combination of charm and emptiness. "The prodigal sister returns," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. He rose, pouring me a glass from a crystal decanter. "How's Oregon? Your little wine shop still paying the bills?" The condescension was so familiar, it almost felt like home. I just shrugged, accepting the glass, but not drinking from it. Suddenly, Julian sighed, his voice dropping, his expression clouding over with a surprising weariness. "I know Dad isn't fair to you. His philosophy is ancient. Sometimes I get tired of it too." He raised his glass. "Welcome home, Eva. Whatever happens, we're still family." For a second, a moment of weakness, I almost believed him. Maybe he'd changed. Maybe he was a prisoner in this gilded cage too, just as desperate to escape. Just then, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and stepped out onto the balcony to take the call, leaving the glass door slightly ajar. His voice drifted back, carrying lethal fragments of conversation. "No, it has to be cash. That's right, 6 bottles of the 78 Valerius first vintage. He'll never know they're gone. We'll just say they spoiled in the cellar." The wine glass in my hand felt like a block of ice. The 78 first vintage. It wasn't just wine. It was the cornerstone. It was our grandfather's legacy, priceless, a legend in the wine world. And Julian, my brother, who had just spoken of family, was selling our soul on the black market for cash. He came back inside, the charming smile plastered back on his face. "Business," he said. "You know how it is." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as an incompetent heir, but as a traitor, a rot that was hollowing out this empire from the inside. "Anyway, things are about to change around here," he added casually, perhaps to fill the tense silence. "Dad has his plans." A seed of suspicion took root in my mind. Julian knew more than he was letting on, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that tomorrow's Thanksgiving performance was going to be far more brutal than I had ever imagined. I set my untouched glass down on the table. This war, I realized, I would have to fight alone. The formal dining room was a masterpiece of suffocating elegance. The long mahogany table gleamed under a crystal chandelier set with heirloom china that only ever saw the light of day on holidays. It was beautiful, but it felt like a tomb. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy as lead. We took our seats. My father, Arthur, sat at the head of the table, a king on his throne. I was placed at the far opposite end, a deliberate act of distancing. And then my father introduced the guest he had alluded to. It wasn't a business partner. It was Monsieur Dubois, the world-renowned French wine critic, a man whose palate could make or break a vineyard with a single review. His presence instantly electrified the room, forcing my mother and Julian into a state of strained, perfect performance. The meal began a silent, tense affair. Then came the wine tasting. Arthur announced with a theatrical flourish that we would hold a special blind tasting to challenge Monsieur Dubois' famous palate. 2 glasses of Pinot Noir were poured for him, their labels hidden. Monsieur Dubois sipped the first glass, our Valerius flagship. He nodded approvingly. Classic structure, he murmured in his French accent. Elegant, controlled, very well made. Then he lifted the second glass. He swirled it, inhaled its aroma, and took a sip. His eyes, which had been professionally placid, widened. A look of genuine surprise of delight crossed his features. "Ah," he breathed. This is alive. It is authentic. It has a soul. It does not try to be great. It simply is. This, my friends, is the future of wine." Julian and my mother beamed with pride, assuming it was some new secret vintage my father had crafted. I felt a terrifyingly familiar taste on my tongue, and my heart began to pound against my ribs. Arthur smiled, a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. He reached out and revealed the label on the second bottle. It was Aura Wines, my wine. This wasn't a compliment. It was a perfectly executed trap. He turned to Monsieur Dubois, his voice tripping with false humility. "Sir, this authentic thing you praise, it is the product of my daughter Clara, a little experiment from Oregon." Then he addressed the entire table, his voice booming with condescending authority. "You see, it has soul, but it lacks class. It is a wild, undisciplined thing. It does not carry the Valerius signature. Thank you, my dear daughter, for showing us all the difference between art and impulse." He had used the highest praise from the world's most respected critic as a weapon, publicly crucifying my philosophy in front of my family and a man who held the power to shape opinions globally. The humiliation was 1,000 times sharper, 1,000 times more profound than the one I had suffered in the cellar 10 years ago. The air at the table became unbreathable. Monsieur Dubois looked deeply uncomfortable. My mother refilled her wine glass with a trembling hand. The turkey was served carved with ceremonial precision by my father, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. After the main course plates were cleared, Arthur stood. He tapped his knife against his crystal glass, the sharp ping slicing through the tension. It was time for his traditional Thanksgiving announcement. Julian sat up straighter, a flicker of anticipation in his eyes. He believed that after demolishing me, his father would now anoint him, confirm his status as the heir apparent. Eliza had her phone poised, ready to capture the historic family moment. My mother held her breath, and I thought my heart was a raw, bleeding wound, simply waited for the final act of my father's play. Arthur surveyed the table, his gaze sweeping over each of his children. His voice was hard as stone. "Legacy is a burden, and I have come to realize that none of you are strong enough to carry it." He paused, letting the words sink in a poison seeping into the room. "Therefore, I have made a decision. I have agreed to sell Valerius Vineyards." Julian's fork and knife clattered onto his plate. Eliza gasped, her phone forgotten. But Arthur wasn't finished. "That brings me to the second part of my announcement. The proceeds from the sale will not be distributed to you, my children, as an inheritance. Instead, The money will be used to establish the Valerius Foundation, dedicated to preserving the traditional arts of winemaking. He looked at each of us in turn, his voice dropping to an icy whisper that cut deeper than any shout. You will get nothing. The title of my life story spoken like a death sentence. It was the sound of every last illusion shattering. The room exploded. That's my birthright! Julian roared, slamming his fist on the table and rattling the china. You promised me! Eliza burst into theatrical sobs. But even through her tears, she managed to start a live stream broadcasting our family's implosion to her followers. My mother just shook her head, her trembling hand reaching for the wine bottle itself. And through it all, I remained perfectly still. I calmly picked up my dessert fork and took a small, deliberate bite of pecan pie. My silence, my stillness in the eye of the hurricane was so unnatural. It was terrifying. Arthur, clearly savoring the chaos he had unleashed, finally turned his attention to me. He smirked. And what about you? Clara? Nothing to say. Have you finally realized that the soul in your wine can't pay the bills? He believed he had won. He believed he had broken my career, my spirit, everything. I set my fork down gently on the plate. I looked up, meeting his triumphant gaze with an unnerving cold calm. I have just one question, Father, I said. My voice was clear and steady, cutting through the weeping and shouting. Who is the buyer? Arthur's chest puffed out with pride, thrilled to hold the final piece of information. A very private but aggressive investment firm. They have a remarkable vision for the future of the wine industry. A firm out of Oregon. He paused for dramatic effect. They call themselves Our Wines. The name dropped into the room like a bomb. Monsieur Dubois. The critic fumbled his wine glass, a splash of red, staining the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. Julian froze, the color draining from his face. Eleanor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Arthur looked around, bewildered by the sudden, horrified silence. I smiled. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, any joy. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Father, I said, each word a perfectly sharpened blade. I am Aura Wines. A stunned, horrified silence fell over the room. It was absolute, as if the very air had solidified. Absurd! This is a joke! Arthur stammered, his composure finally cracking. Julian was the first to find his voice, immediately pointing an accusing finger at me. You've been spying on the company. This is corporate espionage. You betrayed this family. I stood up, and the simple act felt like a coronation. The energy in the room shifted. I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was the CEO. It's not espionage, Julian. It's called due diligence. And my due diligence found some very interesting things. I looked directly at my brother, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. For instance, it found that 6 bottles of the 78 Valerius First Vintage Grandfather's Legacy went missing from the cellar and were sold through a black market broker in Hong Kong. The money was wired directly to an account in Macau. Shall I continue? Julian shrank back as if I had physically struck him. I turned my gaze to my father. I gave you a chance. 6 months ago, a third party called the Phoenix Group sent you a partnership proposal. It would have modernized Valerius's technology and distribution while keeping the family name. You rejected it without even reading past the first page. Phoenix Group was my shell company. Finally cornered his legacy and his honor in ruins, Arthur roared, unleashing his final desperate ultimatum. You can be my daughter, or you can be the person who took my company. You cannot be both. I looked at him, and the old pain was gone, replaced by a profound weariness. That's where you're wrong, Father. I have always been both. You just refuse to see it. He slammed his hands on the table and stormed out of the dining room, the sound of his study door slamming shut, echoing like a gunshot. The Thanksgiving feast was over. The Valerius family was shattered the morning after Thanksgiving. The Valerius estate was as silent as a tomb. Dawn broke, casting a pale gray light that filtered through the library's tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I hadn't slept. I sat behind the massive oak desk that had once been my father's throne, the final acquisition papers spread before me like a map of a conquered kingdom. At 9 a.m., it would all be official. The press release was written. The lawyers were on standby. The empire would be mine. But the feeling inside me wasn't triumph. It was a vast, hollow exhaustion, the kind that comes after a long and brutal war. One by one, the survivors of the shipwreck came to me drawn to the new center of power. My mother was first. She drifted into the room like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her carefully constructed elegance shattered. She didn't rage or accuse. She pleaded, her voice a fragile whisper. Clara, your father. He has built his entire life around this vineyard. Every vine, every bottle, it's a piece of him. If you take it from him, you will kill him. I'm begging you, as your mother, reconsider. We can find another way. There must be another way. Her voice was thick with a desperation so raw, it was almost convincing. And for a moment, a pang of pity struck me. The daughter in me, the one I thought I'd killed long ago, stirred. I looked at her, my own voice, quiet but steady, cutting through her performance. Did you know Julian was selling the cellar's wine, Mother? She flinched as if I'd slapped her, her eyes darting away to a dark corner of the room. He had debts, terrible debts. I only thought, if I gave him a little money, he would stop. So you knew, I said, the pity evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. My voice dropped, losing all its warmth. You knew he was stealing our grandfather's legacy, and you gave him money to cover his tracks. You were silent, just as you were silent 10 years ago when Father humiliated me in the cellar. You've spent your whole life being silent. I leaned forward, forcing her to meet my gaze. Let's be honest, Mother. You aren't afraid your husband will die. You're afraid your quiet, comfortable, silent life will. The truth of it hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. She wasn't a victim. She was an enabler, a silent partner in my father's tyranny and my brother's crimes. She offered no defense, only a single silent tear that traced a path through her expensive makeup before she turned and drifted out of the room. Eliza came next. The vapid influencer was gone, replaced by a shrewd, calculating woman who had clearly been up all night strategizing. Her eyes were red-rimmed but focused. I've built a personal brand from nothing. Clara, she said, getting straight to the point. Her voice was steady, a business pitch. I have over 1 million followers who listen to what I say. I can help you. I can spin this. A story of female empowerment, the forgotten sister reclaiming her birthright. We'd be a powerhouse team. You have the empire. I can craft the narrative. You need a public face, and I need real substance. I studied my younger sister, a strange mix of disgust and admiration for her raw, transactional nature. She saw the world as a series of angles and opportunities. An interesting proposal, I said slowly. Here is my counteroffer. Your first act as a brand ambassador for Aura Wines will be to post a public, unfiltered apology for promoting a lifestyle of hollow luxury, admitting that you knew nothing about the product you were supposedly representing. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. You will then enroll in the Master Sommelier Certification Program. You will work in the vineyards. You will learn the actual art of winemaking from the ground up. You will learn what it means to have dirt under your fingernails. The color drained from Eliza's perfectly contoured face. My offer wasn't a collaboration. It was demand for a complete and total deconstruction of the person she had built. It was a path to authenticity, and it terrified her. I summoned them to my father's study. The air in the room, once the heart of his power, was now thick with the stench of defeat. This wasn't a family talk. This was a corporate restructuring. I sat behind the desk and they stood before me. I slid two thick folders across the polished wood toward Julian. The folder on the left. I explained, my voice devoid of emotion. Contains a voluntary resignation agreement. It includes a 10-year repayment plan for the $1.2 million worth of assets you stole. You will sign it, you will leave the property by sundown, and you will disappear. I let him absorb that before continuing. The folder on the right contains all the evidence. Transaction records from the offshore accounts, emails of sworn testimony from the black market broker in Hong Kong, who was more than willing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. If you do not sign the first folder, the second will be sent by courier to the district attorney's office at noon today. He looked desperately toward our father for help, for some sign of the old patriarchal protection. But Arthur just sat there in his wingback chair, staring to the cold fireplace, a broken monarch stripped of his crown. The silence was his answer. You wouldn't dare do this to your own brother. Julian snarled a final pathetic show of defiance. I said nothing. I simply tapped a single manicured finger on the folder on the right. He stared at it, at the damning pages visible through the cover sheet, at the undeniable proof of his betrayal. His whole body trembled, a tremor of rage and fear. After a long, suffocating silence, he slumped in defeat, snatched the pen and scrawled his signature on the resignation form. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of the end of an era. Then I turned to my father. I'm not kicking you out. This legacy is yours too. He looked up, and for the first time I saw not anger, but a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. A faint, desperate flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. For a second, he thought I was offering an olive branch, a return to some semblance of the old order. I am offering you the position of chairman emeritus. I continued, extinguishing that flicker immediately. It is an advisory role. You will have no executive power. You can keep this office as a museum to what was, and your first official duty will be to fly to Hong Kong on a commercial flight and use your personal reputation to buy back the 6 bottles of first vintage that Julian sold. You will do it with your own money from your personal accounts. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a finely crafted punishment, a penance designed to fit the crime. I was forcing him to confront and clean up the mess his own blind pride had enabled. I was forcing him to admit that his precious, powerful reputation was now only good for fixing his own mistakes, one humiliating transaction at a time. A year can change everything. The grand, imposing sign at the entrance to the estate now read, Valerius and Aura. It was a statement, a fusion of the old and the new, of legacy and revolution. I stood in the winery with Matteo, tasting a new experimental batch from a gleaming stainless steel tank. It was the biodynamic Pinot Noir, the very same wine I had been humiliated for proposing 11 years ago. It was complex, vibrant, and utterly authentic. It was now slated to be one of our most celebrated products. I had settled into my role as CEO. The defensive armor I had worn for a decade had slowly melted away, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence that came not from a name, but from accomplishment. Arthur, after his humbling trip to Hong Kong, a trip from which he returned visibly older and quieter, had changed. He spent most of his days in the vineyards, not as a king surveying his lands, but as a teacher, patiently showing the younger viticulturists the old techniques for pruning and grafting. Our weekly meetings were tense and professional, often filled with disagreements, but they were debates between equals, not lectures from a patriarch. We were learning to respect each other's expertise. Eleanor drank less. She had taken over managing the estate's public tours and events, and to everyone's surprise, she thrived. She found a purpose in sharing the story of the vineyard, her story with the world. We had started having small, hesitant conversations about things other than business books, the weather a shared memory from a time before the bitterness set in. They were fragile bridges, but they were being built. Eliza, true to her survivalist nature, had accepted my challenge. She was halfway through her sommelier course, and her Instagram now featured surprisingly insightful posts about soil types and fermentation techniques juxtaposed with her signature stylish photos. She was finding a value in herself that had nothing to do with her reflection, and for the first time, her audience was engaging with her mind, not just her face. As for Julian, he had vanished after signing the papers. Then, one afternoon, 6 months later, my phone rang with an unknown international number. It was him. He wasn't calling to ask for money or to curse my name. His voice was quiet, distant, stripped of its old arrogance. "I'm working at a winery in Chile," he said, the connection crackling. "Starting over, cleaning tanks. I wanted to say, your wine, the Ora Pinot. I tried it. It's really good." And then he hung up. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement, a seed of something new planted in a faraway land. Thanksgiving arrived again. The air was crisp, the leaves on the vines a brilliant tapestry of gold and crimson. There was no grand formal dinner in the tomb-like dining room. Instead, we gathered at a simple wooden table, set up outside in the heart of the vineyard, surrounded by the source of our livelihood and our pain. It was just me, Arthur, Eleanor, Eliza, and Matteo, the five of us. There was no performative ritual of gratitude. We just talked, laughed even. Eliza told a funny story about a disastrous wine tasting exam. My mother spoke excitedly about a new historical tour she was planning. Arthur stood and opened a bottle of wine. It was the first vintage of the Valerius and Aura, Pinot Noir, the product of our two philosophies colliding and creating something new and beautiful. He poured a glass for me first, a small but significant gesture. Then he poured for the others. He raised his own, the late afternoon sun, catching the deep ruby of the wine in his glass. He looked directly at me, his eyes clear. "To this year's harvest," he said. In those four simple words, I heard everything he couldn't say. It wasn't an apology for the past. It was an acknowledgement of the present. It was a toast to the future we were building together on the ashes of the one he had destroyed. It was everything I ever needed to hear. I raised my glass, meeting my father's gaze, and smiled at him a real smile for the first time in over a decade. I took a sip of the wine. It wasn't sweet, and it wasn't bitter. It tasted of the earth, rich and complex. It tasted of patience, of struggle, and of a new beginning. It tasted like a true harvest. Looking back, winning was never the point. The revenge I craved was sweet, but it left me feeling hollow. The real healing wasn't in the victory, but in the quiet moments that followed a difficult conversation, an unexpected admission, and a shared glass of wine where a lifetime of pain was finally acknowledged. My family isn't perfect. We're scarred, but we're trying. This story is about family, that complicated, messy, and profound thing I think we all understand. If that feeling resonates with you, even a little, I have one small wish. Just comment with a single word, yes. It's a quiet signal that you get it, that even in our most private battles, we're not truly alone.